Hello all, and thank you for joining us today for the Hazardous Material Business Plan Requirements webinar. Today's presentation will be about 30 minutes, and we will allow some time for questions. And if you do have questions as we go throughout, please feel free to type those in the chat box, and we will try and address those as they come up. My name is Nicholas Armstrong of NES, and a copy of today's presentation will be available in a PDF form. Going to nesglobal.net/webinar-downloads, and you can obtain a PDF copy of today's webinar, as well as a recorded copy will be made available on YouTube within a few business days. So if you have any technical difficulties through today's presentation, that will be made available, and I will give you contact information at the end, how you can reach out and obtain more information on that as well. We will be covering the basic requirements. It'll be a high-level overview of the standard requirements applicable to most all businesses within the state of California. And we will be able to get into some detail for particular questions towards the end, but keeping in mind that these are basic requirements and a basic overview of the HMBP applicability. So for today's outline for the Hazardous Material Business Plan, we will cover applicability, general applicability, not really getting into many of the exclusions or exemptions, the HMBP overview itself, what it fundamentally is about, submitting the HMBP elements, where those get submitted to and who is reviewing those, as well as the employee training requirements, an outline of what needs to be covered for your particular employees at your sites. And then we'll talk briefly about spill reporting, focused on spill reporting requirements in the state of California and the expectations for your CUPA, as well as the state agencies, not particularly getting into the federal spill reporting requirements. So for applicability, in California, it does vary based on your jurisdiction. Your local counties do have some variability in the reporting requirements, and you may have noticed that, particularly for those businesses that have several sites located up and down the state. But what we're talking about, keep in mind, is going to be what is outlined in the California Health and Safety Code and the state expectations, with the local reporting requirements being found in your local county requirements. So a business is required to establish and implement an HMBP if it meets the following conditions. It handles a hazardous material, including mixtures containing hazardous materials, equal to or greater than the reporting thresholds. And those reporting thresholds for liquids are 55 gallons, 500 pounds for solids, and 200 cubic feet for compressed gases. Keeping in mind that there are some additional reporting thresholds for acutely hazardous materials, which would be found in the federal tables. But generally, this is up and down the state of California are thresholds for reporting. 55 gallons for liquids, 500 pounds for solids, and 200 cubic feet for compressed gases. Additionally, there are some higher thresholds for chemicals that are classified by OSHA solely as irritants or sensitizers. 5,000 pounds for solids and 550 gallons for liquids, and those are only for those chemicals which are classified as irritants or sensitizers, particularly noted with this pictogram. Keeping in mind that there are some additional lower thresholds for acutely hazardous materials found in the federal tables. So we'll cover some of the elements of what the HMBP overview is, and if you guys have any questions on particularly what they're defining as a hazardous material, we can address that in more detail at the end. But generally, anything that is required to have a safety data sheet, and sometimes additionally people will include things that have safety data sheets when they're not required as their hazardous materials, which are reported into the SIRS system, and we'll define what SIRS is here briefly. So the HMBP program was established in California in 1986. The intention, the goal of the program, to prevent potential damage to public health or the environment from the release of hazardous materials. The requirements for developing an HMBP and the elements that go in it are found in the California Health and Safety Code. Division 20, Chapter 6.95, Article 1. This is where you will find the general requirements of HMBP, the applicability, with some additional information being found in the California Code of Regulation. But all of your requirements for your businesses will be found here in the California Health and Safety Code. The statutes are enforced by your CUPA. For those of you unfamiliar with the phrase CUPA, that is the Certified Unified Program Agency. That is the local authority that has been given jurisdiction to enforce, oversee, and ensure compliance. Their job is to ensure compliance with the requirements. The HMBP facilitates the federal requirements of EPCRA, the Emergency Planning, Community, and Right to Know Act, keeping in mind that the communities do have the right to know about the materials, the hazardous materials that are being handled, stored, and used by the businesses around them. And so that is one of the main intentions as well for the electronic submittals, is allowing public access to the information which they have the right to know about. So we'll get into the submittals and how those are submit, and particularly the elements of those submittals, what is included in each one of those elements, and some standard expectations from your CUPA. The first of the 4 elements is the business owner or operator identification. Here is a sample of the Unidocs form. Electronically, it looks a little different. It contains the exact same information, though, being facility information, business owner information, environmental contacts, and the emergency contacts. The second element of the Hazardous Material Business Plan submittal are the business activities. What are you doing as a business that is regulated? Meaning, do you have on site for any purpose, whether you are storing it, using it, or just generally handling it at your facility for a particular need, hazardous materials above the reporting thresholds? And those thresholds, again, are 55 gallons for liquids, 500 pounds for solids, and 200 cubic feet for compressed gases. Do you store hazardous materials or hazardous substances in an underground storage tank? This is one of the other elements of the business activities. Are you subject to APSA, Above Ground Petroleum Storage Act, and thus required to have an SPCC plan? Additionally, are you a hazardous waste generator? And it asks you various questions about being a hazardous waste generator, including on-site treatment, excluded recyclable materials. Those all become part of the hazardous waste generator activity. So these are the different portions of the business activity element, which is one of the 4 submittal elements. Additionally, there are some local requirements. We don't have time to get into all those specifics because those are very variable based on the county and jurisdiction, and those are going to be decided by your local CUPA and local ordinances. For the site map, this is the 3rd of the 4th element. The site map contains the hazardous material storage locations, as well as the hazardous material locations where they are used and handled, the north orientation arrow, the gas, water, power, and other utility shutoffs and access points, storm drains, as well as sewer drains, streets bordering the facility, evacuation routes, and assembly areas. So these are some of the general elements that go into a map, and keeping in mind the intention of the map and the program itself is to facilitate emergency response. That's really the main intention here of the HMBP, as well as communicating the information to the communities. It is intended to communicate the information to emergency responders and those involved in any sort of response action. And then the final element of the HMBP submittal is the contingency plan. The contingency plan or consolidated emergency response plan being the plan that is designed to contain all the information in the event of a release, threatened release, or real emergency. Includes your emergency contacts, containment and cleanup procedures, evacuation procedures, emergency equipment, the types and the location, as well as any areas of your business or activities that have vulnerability to earthquakes. This is a high-level overview of most people's standard emergency response plan. A lot of sites do have their own plans, but submitting the emergency response contingency plan is often required by many of the local CUPAs, as well as it will ensure that you include all of the required elements for your emergency response plan. The training plan being part of the emergency response, the employee training plan. Employees must be trained on emergency response, evacuation procedures. And you can see this is a sample of the Unidocs form that is complete and submit as part of your Hazardous Material Business Plan, which is uploaded into SIRS. You can elect that the training plan is not applicable because the facility has no employees, but the information included here, employees are trained on internal alarms, notifications, evacuation, re-entry procedures, and the assembly point locations, emergency incident reporting, external emergency response notifications, so both internal and external notifications they need to be aware of, locations of the emergency response equipment, some additional information, the safe methods for handling, storing hazardous materials, spill procedures, as well as particularly for the emergency response teams for your facilities, shutdown of operation, personnel rescue procedures. And you may have all of these elements selected or a few of these. You may not have your own internal emergency response team. Keeping in mind that in addition to the training requirements here for SIRS and HMBP elements, you still are going to have to worry about your OSHA training requirements and possibly your hazardous waste training requirements. So what you cover with your HMBP training may not cover all of the elements you need as a business to cover with your employees. The chemical inventory is one of the main things that people get tripped up on or miss elements. It does contain a lot of information. Keep in mind that this is going to be applicable to those regulated chemicals, those that exceed the thresholds of 55 gallons for liquids, 500 pounds for solids, or 200 cubic feet for compressed gas. Each one of those is going to have their own chemical inventory description, including the chemical names, common names, physical state, the hazard category or applicable categories, keeping in mind that those changed this year. They've been expanded, and the next slide will show you an overview of the expanded chemical categories. The average daily amount and the max daily amount, the number of days on site, as well as the largest container and the type of container, so they are easily identified by the emergency responders, and your storage locations, so they know what part of the facility to expect the bulk of your chemicals. One thing that we'll briefly talk about here, for those of you who have not had experience yet dealing with the chemical inventories, there used to be 5 EPA hazard categories, and now they expanded it, which much more closely mock the OSHA hazard categories. In the physical categories, you'll find flammable, gas under pressure, explosive, self-heating, pyrophoric liquids or solids, pyrophoric gases, oxidizers, organic peroxide, self-reactives, in contact emits flammable gas, combustible dust, corrosive to metal, and an additional category of hazard not otherwise classified, which you will find that same description under the health category. Simple asphyxiants, germ cell mutagenicity, aspiration hazards, specific target organ toxicity, serious eye damage or eye irritation, respiratory or skin sensitization, skin corrosion or skin irritation, reproductive toxicity, acute toxicity, and carcinogens are also identified under the health category. So 2 main groupings, and a much more expanded hazard description starting this year. So keep that in mind as you go to update your chemical inventories and your hazardous material business plans. Now that you have seen a brief overview of all the information that is included in an HMBP, the elements must be submitted electronically. There are still a handful of local reporting portals, but for the most part, up and down the state of California, your submittals, all those elements we covered, are submit into what is described as CERS, California Environmental Reporting System, commonly referred to as CERS. This is where the electronic submission of all those elements that we discussed go into. There is the address there in case you are looking for it, but a simple search in a search engine looking for CERS and you will find the link to it. You must be a registered user as part of a business to get into the system. However, keeping in mind the information that does go into CERS is publicly available through a separate Cal EPA portal. And then there's different levels of site access. And you have to assign users for sites. You can assign reviewers, but every business is going to have at least one primary authorized user for that business. So HMBP submittals do require an annual renewal or recertification. Is required by March 1st, which is outlined in the California Health and Safety Code, or a locally enforceable renewal date. There are many different jurisdictions that do not stick to just the March 1st date. For example, Sac County has an anniversary date. San Joaquin County, January 15th is their renewal date. So make sure you're paying attention to your particular local jurisdiction, because they may not go with just the state standard, which is based off the federal standard of March 1st. If you have any significant changes, you are required to update your HMBP within 30 days. And we'll briefly talk about some significant changes that are going to require updates to those plans. But these are some important dates and reminders, particularly the 30-day update, because there's a lot of changes I've seen in a lot of businesses, and so make sure you're paying attention and working with the different groups that are handling these chemicals or that are modifying operations or storage locations, because you'll have to update your maps, possibly your chemical inventories, as well as contact information. If there is a 100% increase in the quantity of a previously disclosed hazardous material, you must update your HMBP within 30 days. So if we reported we had 55 gallons of, say, used oil, and we increased to 110 gallons, that would require us to update our plan within 30 days of that change. So a doubling of the chemicals on site for any amount of time is going to require an update within 30 days. Or additionally, if you now are handling any hazardous materials that exceed a reporting threshold that had not previously been included, you're going to need to update your plan to include those new chemicals now at your facility. Additionally, if you change the business or facility address, you need to update the plan. The plans go with each individual site, so you don't just move a plan. You have to update the plan to reflect the actual operations, the actual layout of your facilities. So keep that in mind if you do change facility addresses or locations. A change in business ownership will require updates, as well as a change in business name. So really making sure that all the information is accurate and up to date and reflective of your current operations. Additionally, a substantial change in the handler's operation, which would require modifications to the HMBP, must be included within 30 days. A substantial change is any change that could inhibit the immediate response during an emergency. So the addition of interior walls, exterior gates, chemical storage locations. For example, if you need to move a tank or your general outdoor chemical storage location, make sure you're updating your plans, particularly on the maps, to note where those chemicals are being stored, handled, and or used. So we'll briefly talk about the employee training requirements, what elements need to be covered, and then we'll get into the spill response and reporting requirements, and then we'll have plenty of time to open the floor for questions. All employees must be trained on safety procedures in the event of a release or threatened release of hazardous material. A real release, it escapes secondary containment, enters any sort of waterway, or the escapement of a gas into the air, or you have some material that has left your property and entered the ground on someone else's property or public property. A threatened release is a situation where there is a requirement for an immediate response to prevent a real release. So you have a little bit of a release into secondary containment with a lot of rainwater, and particularly on a rainy day in Northern California, if you didn't respond immediately, you may have an actual release. So keeping in mind the difference between a threatened release and a real release, but we'll talk about the reporting requirements for those as well. Notification contacts, who are they notifying and when must those notifications be made, both internal and external notifications, and what your expectations of the employees are for those notifications. Procedures for mitigation of a release or threatened release of a hazardous material to minimize harm to people, property, or the environment. So this is another one of the elements the employees must be trained on, as well as the evacuation procedures, whether there are additional shutdown of operations or just evacuation and the assembly areas. The employee training plan and the training elements can take into consideration and should take into consideration the position and the particular duties assigned to that employee. This training must be documented, and the documentation must be available for a minimum of 3 years. So make sure that the elements that you're covering are appropriate for each individual employee based on what they do as part of their job function and what their expectations are in a real emergency. And do not forget to document. Always document this training. One, it's an easy way to show you're meeting the requirements, but two, it is required to maintain the documentation for your employee training. So the different elements of a HMBP training: the hazardous material handling, response agency coordination procedures, emergency response plans, the procedures for immediate notification for emergency response agencies for the CUPA and Cal OES. This was taken from one of Cal OES's old documents. They used to be Cal EMA. That should say Cal OES, as well as on-site emergency personnel, identification of local emergency medical assistance and the resources. That's one thing you should pay particular attention to for your HMBP plans and the closest medical facilities. Sometimes those hospitals do consolidate, close, or if you had a urgent care identified, those things do pop up. They close, they move. So make sure you're paying particular attention to the local emergency assistance resource that you've identified. Hazard mitigation, prevention, and abatement procedures, additionally including notification and evacuation, identification of facility areas, equipment, and systems which are vulnerable to earthquakes, and the use and the maintenance of your emergency response equipment and supplies. So these are all the details of the elements that need to be covered with your employees. So moving on to spill reporting, better described as release or threatened release notifications, because you do have to make immediate notifications as well for threatened release. So keep that in mind as you're developing your spill reporting or your release reporting protocol and procedures. Make sure you capture a description of threatened releases and what those mean to you at your facility. Upon discovery of any hazardous material release or threatened release, you must immediately report or make notification to the local CUPA or the AA, the administering agency, and Cal OES. So those are the two agencies. Regardless of quantity, any amount, you must make notification to the CUPA or the AA, as well as Cal OES, the Governor's Office of Emergency Services. Additionally, make sure you pay attention to the amounts released and other state and federal reporting requirements. There are federal reporting tables as well as some state reporting tables. And if you guys have particular questions on that, feel free to email me after the presentation. I'll provide that information. But these two, regardless of amount, need to have immediate notification provided. And your CUPAs may require some follow-up written notification, but always make the verbal notification identifying within your plan the local CUPA's phone number. And so make sure you have that always handy. And anywhere in the state, that's the Cal OES phone number for making the immediate notification to Cal OES. Make sure the information you're obtaining for any of these reports, obviously the primary response action should be to minimize and mitigate as much of the emergency as possible, preserving human health first always. So making the reports when it is safe to do so, but immediately when it's safe to do so, make sure you're making these reports. The name of the caller, location, date, and the time of the release, potential for any impact to waterways and or storm drains, the hazardous material, it's the particular information for that, what was it, and how much was released. If you can figure that out, make sure you have that information available. Sometimes it does take follow-up. It's not necessarily clear how much material was released. So if you have that information available, you may have to do calculations. This is all the information you want to make available when making these verbal notifications to the CUPA and Cal OES. So that's all we were going to cover today as far as slides for the basic elements of an HMBP. Keeping in mind that each one of your sites is going to have a site-specific HMBP, and the details are going to be different, as well as your contacts internally might be different. But at this time, I'll open up the floor. If you have questions, you want to type them in, you can. I'll provide my email in the chat box, even though it is available there, narmstrong@nesglobal.net. If you have any additional questions or having difficulties obtaining the presentation, which is available at the link above, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Or if you'd like a link when the video is available on YouTube, we can get that forwarded to you as well. So at this time, if you have any questions, please go ahead. The one question came up is, if a chemical is no longer on site, when can it be removed from the plan? It should be removed as soon as practical, but you should make sure that is done within 30 days, because that would be necessary information to provide to the CUPA, as well as any sort of emergency responders. They would want to know that those chemicals are not there at that facility. So you can do it immediately, but make sure you do that within 30 days for any changes. That would be a substantial change to your business that would affect emergency response.
Okay, I've got a question.
Go ahead.
Okay, I work for the hospital, and so the gas cylinder, the compressed gas, and you were saying that that's 500 cubic feet, right?
Compressed gases are 200 cubic feet. There are some additional exemptions for gases in healthcare settings. And I can send you some links on that information if you want to shoot me an email, but 200 cubic feet for compressed gases.
Okay, so 200 cubic feet for compressed gas. Good to know. All right, and then for the small clinic, I was told that it's 1,000 cubic feet. But you know what? I think I'd probably send you an email if we could talk about that further.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because there are some exemptions which we didn't get into today, especially with the variety of participants. But there are specific exemptions, and some are specifically for healthcare settings on the amount of gases that they can have and the types of those gases. So feel free to email me, and I can provide you more information.
Thanks for your help.
Yeah.
Great, will do. Thanks.
Thank you. So one of the questions that came up here is the APSA section for AST reporting need to be submit annually if the tank inventory hasn't changed? I think you're referring to the tank statement. If the tank inventory hasn't changed, you'll still need to update your APSA section, and then the tank statement is an additional page that is included if you have exceeded the single tanks of 10,000 gallons. And so that's not going to need to be changed. You'll just have to recertify that annually, making a statement that nothing has changed that affects that. When you do your annual recertification and then you do a 3-year review, you'll just make note that nothing has changed